It's the battle of the century! Wait, now it is. The Nintendo DS and Game Boy Advance. Now many would say, oh well, the Nintendo DS is the successor to the Game Boy Advance. Yes and no. Because at the time when the DS released, it was only 2004. The GBA was only 3 years old. 3 years into your current system's life and you introduce its successor? That's not gonna work because Nintendo didn't really advertise the DS as a GBA successor. It was a third pillar, if you will. You have GameCube, DS, and Game Boy Advance, all coexisting at once. A lot of games were still coming out for the Game Boy Advance. First-party games from Nintendo, specifically stuff like The Legend of Zelda, The Minish Cap, and Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. And that was all because, really, the Nintendo DS was kind of Nintendo's first foray into non-Game Boy handheld territory. Even the Virtual Boy had half the Game Boy's name in it, and with all the random junk thrown into this thing, 2 screens, a touchscreen, microphone, all this random garbage, and games that were definitely a bit differently designed compared to how they were back on the good old GBA. Yeah, Nintendo was a bit skeptical on whether or not the DS was a true successor. So, boom! The DS was introduced while the GBA was still hot on the market. Which made really no sense because, you know, the DS had a Game Boy Advance slot. They called it backwards compatibility. It was a backwards compatible system, which implies the Game Boy Advance was the predecessor to the Nintendo DS. Why would you put backwards compatibility to something when this isn't a successor? It was the fucking successor. Nintendo just likes to play coy when they introduce successors like this because they're not sure if it's going to succeed. So they're like, oh, don't worry, this is still a thing. But then when it turned out the DS was a huge success, yeah, they threw this out like a dirty sock. But that makes me question, which one of these is the better system? Which one had a better library, better design, better revisions, better graphics for the time they released, better sound, blah, 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 blah. I don't know, let's just talk about it. With the first thing that you'll probably notice with either one of these, the design. Now, the Game Boy Advance, you had 3 major versions, with this one being the first one, the OG Game Boy Advance. And this featured a form factor we hadn't yet seen from Nintendo handhelds at the time, outside of the Game & Watch line, which is a more horizontal form factor. And this feels great. It just fits in your hands so much better. The newly added shoulder buttons just feel so natural with how this is oriented. And everything just works so well with this design. The one problem, no backlight on the screen. Damn, no light at all. You can't see shit, mainly because it's not on, but if it was on, you couldn't see shit. Now, of course, this was a step up from the original Game Boy screen, the Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Color, all of that, but it still wasn't lit, and in 2001, that was pretty pathetic. I mean, the Sega Game Gear, Atari Lynx, those handhelds from the early 90s that competed with the original Game Boy had color-lit screens. This was running out of excuses. So Nintendo finally gave in with the Game Boy Advance SP, and this is probably a very easy contender for the greatest system revision of all time. This pretty much introduced so many staples of Nintendo handhelds from that point forward. Specifically, the clamshell design. A lot of people were like, oh my god, it's like a mini laptop. Made me feel like a damn media mogul while I was playing Revenge of the Flying Dutchman. The clamshell design was definitely a welcome addition. It made it so then you could throw this in your pocket without worrying about scratching up the screen or anything like that. And of course, Nintendo continued using this design with the Nintendo DS line of systems, which means, like, hey, I mean, we all look at this and say, like, yeah, this was a great idea. But what was an even better idea was the fact we finally got a backlit display. Well, originally it wasn't backlit, it was front lit. So there's 2 models of the SP, an older version and a newer version. This one's the newer version, where as we can see, it's a much nicer display. It is very well lit. And overall, the SP remains one of my favorite Nintendo handhelds. However, when I compare it to the original Game Boy Advance, I think I definitely prefer this form factor. It's just a lot more comfortable. Playing this, it's just so much more cramped. The shoulder buttons are just so much closer and tinier, and the buttons don't feel as good. They feel good, like there's nothing wrong with them, but I definitely prefer the original Game Boy Advance, which is why you see a lot of people modding the original versions of these to put backlights into these versions. And then we have the Game Boy Micro, pretty much just the fashionable one of the bunch. This one has an even brighter screen, so the screen is a little bit better than the Game Boy Advance SPs. However, one of the coolest things about the Game Boy Advance line was the fact that it played everything. You could play original Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, everything. Game Boy Micro, only Game Boy Advance. It uses a different charger from this one, which that's another positive of this. It introduced rechargeable batteries. This one still used AA's, but this one can't even use the same charger as the SP. It has to use its own proprietary charger. So at the end of the day, this is more of kind of a fashion statement. You could swap this out with different faceplates, which is really cool, and it feels really great to play. This is such a nice little trinket, but that's all it is. It's a damn trinket. So these two definitely have their flaws. The SP, pretty much the only flaw that is really there that everybody can agree on is the fact that it doesn't include a headphone jack. I don't get that. That's weird as hell. You have to get a whole ass adapter for this, but for some reason the multiplayer link cable, that's included. I'm just kind of like, I mean, wouldn't more people use headphones than the link cable? But I digress. Outside of personal preference, that's kind of the only major flaw with the SP, which shows just how amazing of a handheld this was. And they followed it up with this? The original Nintendo DS is a little stinker. This thing just reeks. It is not great. Even on the screen side of things, like you go from the Game Boy Advance SP screen, which looks like this, to it doesn't even turn on. It is an incredibly dim screen that just doesn't look good. And outside of that, like, this is one of the ugliest handhelds of all time. I mean, it has some charm. I just like it from like an old school 2004 retrospective kind of look. You know, for nostalgia purposes and just looking back at like what they thought looked futuristic and modern in 2004. You know, they designed this to look like, oh man, this is a cool ass piece of tech. All the buttons feel fine, and it is very multi-purpose in the fact that it can play DS games and also Game Boy Advance games. That's awesome. Of course, much like the Game Boy Micro, you can only play Game Boy Advance games, not Game Boy or Game Boy Color, but hey, I mean, this is a brand new system. They didn't even have to include Game Boy Advance support, so, you know, But something else I'll say about this original model, these original DSs are some of the most fragile things of all time. They are so goddamn brittle these days. Like, you can, like, just listen to me opening this up. Like, that double click there makes me feel like I'm about to rip this goddamn thing in half. It's incredibly brittle. This plastic does not hold up, which is why I would really recommend getting into any of the other DS systems. Namely, the DS Lite. This was a huge upgrade. It was better than the original in every way. The only thing that I think this thing does worse than the original DS, when you put a Game Boy Advance game into the Game Boy Advance slot, it sticks out a little bit. That's it. Other than that, the design was a huge step up. Everything feels better. The buttons feel better. The screen looks a lot better. The overall design is just so much cleaner. It's so much more refined. This was the DS that really made the DS a household product. But then just for fun or shits and giggles, they made the DSi, which is an upgrade, though it does take away the Game Boy Advance slot, which is definitely a huge downgrade. The original DS felt really old by the time the DSi came out. I mean, like, you couldn't even change a system setting without having to reset the entire system. The DSi came out in 2008 in Japan and 2009 here in North America, and it upgraded the DS to a slightly more competent system around the time. You got a lot of cool new little features like cameras for taking fun pictures and certain games made specifically for the DSi, or some DS games with DSi specific features let you use the cameras in fun little ways. The microphone actually got an application on the system itself. You could play around with sounds you record, and you could actually pop an SD card in and play music files from your PC on there and also transfer your pictures to and from. You could download games to this via the DSi shop channel. That was a huge feature. And while there wasn't like a huge assortment of like must-have titles on there, there's a lot of really fun little doodads there. And if you think size does matter, there's always surgery. And the DSi XL, which was mostly advertised to, the elderly. Pretty crazy because with the Nintendo 3DS, the 3DS XL was kind of advertised as like a pro user system. I guess this was around the time of like tablets and just bigger smartphones and all of that, like power users wanted the bigger screens and all of that, so it made sense for the 3DS XL. The DSi XL, I mean, just the colors they launched it with, burgundy. This was mainly advertised for like older people, like, oh man, like one of those big TV remotes. But this is a fantastic way to play some DS games because the screens are massive and the games look great on them. So in terms of design, I mean, which one did it better? Which one just has a better track record? That's a tricky one. I kind of feel like they're almost pretty even. The DS Lite was kind of the GBASP of the DS line. It retained all the features of the original, but improved everything to like perfection. But it only has like one little flaw, which is the GBA slot just sticks out a little more. But even then, I would consider that to be a less fatal flaw than the GBASP's lack of a damn headphone jack. And the DSi line getting rid of the Game Boy Advance slot, that's a huge blow. In fact, it made some DS games incompatible with the DSi, like the Guitar Hero series, which that's comparable to the Game Boy Micro getting rid of Game Boy and Game Boy Color support. However, those first models, I feel like the original Game Boy Advance was a better first model than the original Nintendo DS was. There is no reason to return to that original DS. And I think the original Game Boy Advance holds up outside of the original screen, which is fixable. But when I look at all of these compared to all of these, and I might have to go with the DS line. That kind of surprises me. I felt like the Game Boy Advance SP would have stolen the show, but when I made that comparison between the DS Lite and the Game Boy Advance SP, it made me realize, like, yeah, the DS Lite is like the GBASP, but it doesn't have that fatal flaw. So yeah, in terms of system design, I'll hand it to the DS line. Next up, we have graphics. Which one was better at the time, So 2004 for the DS, 2001 for the Game Boy Advance. The DS launched with a fully 3D game, Super Mario 64 DS. That was incredible. The Game Boy Advance launched with Super Mario Advance, which was an enhanced remake of the Super Mario All-Stars remake of Super Mario Bros. 2, which the Game Boy Color already had a remake of Super Mario Bros. 1. You had games like The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Seasons and Ages on there, which were full-blown Zelda games. So that just kind of shows, like, while this was a significant leap forward, it wasn't like, oh man, what the hell? We're playing Mario now? The DS introduced 3D Mario on the go, which was incredible. The PSP also launched around this time. Yeah, that's the thing. So the Game Boy Advance, it definitely had some competition. It didn't matter though. But handheld competition around this time wasn't as much of like a drastic contrast as it was comparing the DS to the PSP. The DS looked like dog shit. It was still impressive, don't get me wrong, but like we were already seeing handhelds much more capable than what the DS was doing at the time. The Game Boy Advance was kind of in a league of its own. You had competition in the form of like the N-Gage a couple years later, and the N-Gage had some 3D games. They also ran like dog shit. So it's just like, oh my god, I have Tomb Raider on my phone. I also can't see it, and it's also running at 5 frames a second. But oh my god, I have Tomb Raider on my phone. The Game Boy Advance could do some very light 3D stuff. I mean, like, it was very infrequent, and a lot of times you'd have to put 3D in some major air quotes, but it was still very impressive at the time. And the Game Boy Advance was the first time we got a lot of games that were only available on consoles prior on a handheld for the first time ever. Most notably with Mario Kart Super Circuit. That was insane. And even though it had more in common with Super Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo, so, kind of 2D levels there, it was still Mario Kart. It still played like Mario Kart. You could still play it and be like, yep, this is still Mario Kart. It's still fun Mario Kart. It's not like, this is a watered down handheld version of Mario Kart. It was, but it was still Mario Kart. Now, a game like Mario Kart DS, in comparison, that's a huge leap forward. That no longer really felt like such a watered-down version. In fact, it was superior to the last console entry, Mario Kart Double Dash, in many ways. Online multiplayer, more tracks than ever, a lot of features. Like, you could draw an emblem on your damn cart. That's incredible. Man, visually, that wasn't much of a looker. It was 3D, which was awesome, and being 3D for Mario Kart is a huge bonus, but man, it just was not visually that, appealing. Mario Kart Super Circuit, you could say the same thing, but I feel like games on the Game Boy Advance had a bit more, nice looking style to them. The DS has its own style, 100%. A lot of 3D games kind of look like old school PS1 games. It's really fun. But I'd say games on the Game Boy Advance often just look a lot better. 2D games on the DS, I don't really feel like were that big of a leap from the Game Boy Advance. I mean, they were and they weren't. They just didn't look that drastically better. The DS can do 3D games, which is a huge step up, but this was at the time the PSP was already out, and the PSP was doing PS2 quality stuff, where the DS was struggling to do PS1 style stuff. I just feel like the Game Boy Advance ages a lot better visually. When I look at a Game Boy Advance game these days, I just feel like the picture quality just looks so beautiful. All the pixels are so crisp and nice, and the art styles and art designs of these games just hold up really well. Weirdly, on the DS, I don't feel that way for most games. Like, the text in a lot of games just doesn't look good. A lot of stuff on the DS, in my opinion, just doesn't age that well visually, while on the Game Boy Advance, I feel like it's aged like a fine wine. So, honestly, I'm giving graphics to the Game Boy Advance. But it all comes down to the games. Which handheld had the better library? And this is incredibly tough, because there are definitely different things to note with each library here. The Game Boy Advance has some of the greatest games of all time on it. They're also not Game Boy Advance games. The GBA's library was a bit of a double-edged sword where, you had a lot of Super Nintendo games come to it. And at the time, this was incredible. This was the first time many of these games were portable in an uncompromised or fairly uncompromised fashion. Many times these games had extra content in them, and the Game Boy Advance versions of these games, in many ways, could be considered the definitive releases. However, there's a couple of problems with the fact that the GBA's library, so many of its best games, are remakes, remasters, re-releases, all of that. Yes, it ensures that the library is quality, but it's not its own. Take, for example, the Mario games. Isn't it kind of wacky that the Game Boy Advance doesn't have an original new 2D Mario platformer? You can make some arguments, like in Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Bros. 3, there's a bunch of original levels. Mario vs. Donkey Kong, you can kind of consider to be the Game Boy Advance's original Mario game. But at the end of the day, the Super Mario Advance series is kind of, what the Game Boy Advance was known for when it came to 2D Mario action, and those are all remakes and re-releases. For the majority of the GBA's life, pretty much the Zelda game for it was A Link to the Past and Four Swords, which was phenomenal. I mean, A Link to the Past is A Link to the Past, one of the greatest games of all time, and it came with the little side multiplayer game Four Swords, but still, it's kind of hard to see the Game Boy Advance's library as its own thing. However, in many ways, it still was. Even though we had A Link to the Past, eventually we did get the Minish Cap. With Metroid, we had Metroid Fusion, a completely brand new original Metroid game. And then afterwards, we got a remake of the first Metroid game, Metroid Zero Mission. And both of those games are incredible. And that's something that Nintendo did a bit with the Game Boy Advance. They do like a remake, and then they potentially do an original game. They did that with Kirby, with Kirby's Nightmare in Dreamland, which was a remake of Kirby's Adventure. And then they did Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. Mario Kart Super Circuit, F-Zero, Golden Sun, Fire Emblem, all the Pokemon games. WarioWare got its start on the Game Boy Advance, coexisting alongside Wario Land. I gotta be honest, the Game Boy Advance library is nothing but quality. At least when it came to, you know, the big heavy-hitting titles, the first-party titles. The DS's library, let's talk about it. So, I would say a lot of the Game Boy Advance's shortcomings were kind of fixed with the DES. I mean, no original 2D Mario platformer. Well, we have New Super Mario Brothers here, which is, you know, genuinely one of the most popular games of all time. Which I think emphasizes how the DS had more new and original ideas compared to the Game Boy Advance, which is pretty much what the entire handheld was all about. I mean, all you have to do is look at it. You were gonna get more new experiences on this handheld. There is no doubt about that. But that does open the door for bullshit. Like, yes, we did get 2 brand new Zelda games, 2 top-down Zelda games, but they are some of the most controversial titles in the series, basically based on just how they control. You have to use the touchscreen to control Link, and it doesn't even really feel like you're controlling him. It feels more like you're directing him where to go. Metroid Prime Hunters was incredible to see. However, that was at the time. Now, it's pretty obvious that, you know, like, what would you rather play? A 2D Metroid on the Game Boy Advance or a 3D Metroid on the DS? Doesn't hold up nearly as well. Incredibly impressive, even today. I mean, like, it's crazy to see that thing running on a DS, but I don't want to play it. That doesn't mean the games released on the DS are bad, but I feel like Game Boy Advance, pretty much most of these big, heavy-hitting titles age a lot better here. But when it comes to third-party support, both of these libraries are phenomenal. But I do feel like the DS had so much more variety, originality, incredible ideas, and franchises start. It felt like it was easier for a lot of developers to warrant making stuff for the DS because while it wasn't too powerful, it was definitely powerful enough to get most of your vision across. Where with the Game Boy Advance, it always felt like if you're gonna make something for this handheld, you know, it better be a 2D platformer. But let's just get down to business. Which library is better? Because this is incredibly tough, like I said. Game Boy Advance, I feel like is overall a bit higher quality, but it's less original. Whereas the DS has so many new ideas come to this. You had franchises like Animal Crossing come to a handheld for the first time. Franchises like Mario Kart were finally able to just stretch their legs, and Super Circuit is great for the Game Boy Advance, but what are you more likely to play today? You know, not to take away from what Super Circuit was, but DS was more of like, hey, this is more of an uncompromised Mario Kart experience. The amount of Pokemon games on the DS is unrivaled. Even when it comes to spin-offs, I mean, you have Pokemon Conquest, which is a crossover with, what, Nobunaga's Ambition? What the hell is that? Yeah, GBA had Pokemon Pinball, but DS had Pokemon Dash. And is it fair to make the argument that the DS and DS Lite can play GBA games? That's kind of cheating considering we're kind of trying to look at both of these systems just for what they did themselves. But when I do look at everything, I might have to give it to the DS. The Game Boy Advance is just one of the most quality libraries of any handheld. But the DS has that quality and quantity of originality and also classic games being re-released and remade for the handheld. Though I'd say the quality is a little higher overall with the Game Boy Advance, I just feel like there's a better chance that pick a random Game Boy Advance game, even some shovelware, it's gonna be of a higher quality than the shovelware on DS, you know? But when I take everything into consideration, the new ideas, the old ideas, so many brand new franchises introduced with the DS. So many more types of games playable on the device due to the increased power of the hardware, just the increased capabilities of the hardware with the touchscreen, microphone, dual screens. I do feel like I have to give it to the DS. So yeah, overall, the DS won, which I wasn't really expecting that fully. I actually went into this not necessarily knowing which one was gonna end up winning. And I feel like this is kind of more of like a, how am I feeling when I wake up kind of day. I might wake up being like, oh, the Game Boy Advance is better. Or I might wake up tomorrow and say, oh, the DS is better. But most days, I can't decide.